You came to China in 2006, and before that you have lived in many different countries. So what was your imagination about China before you came here?
My knowledge of China before I came to China was very, very limited. My idea of China, which I think would have been shared by most of my contemporaries, was a very large, very poor country with a couple of outposts of modernity in places like Beijing and Shanghai. As soon as I arrived, I realized what a complete misconception my idea was, because the first time I came, I actually came to meet my wife's family. My wife's Chinese, she comes from Jilin city in Jilin province. And Jilin is a very ordinary city by Chinese standards. It's not big, it's not particularly wealthy. But when I arrived in Jilin and I looked around, I saw a modern, prosperous place with people who weren't dressed in grey rags, they were actually dressed in clothes like me. And it did occur to me that up until the early 2000s, China really wasn't discussed very much in the Western media. People knew that China had achieved impressive growth rates since reform and opening up. But really, you did, unless you went looking, unless you were specifically looking for information about China, you wouldn't really find out a lot. And I think that's maybe related to the fact that China was still a very distant speck on the horizon as far as the West was concerned. And it was only really in the early 2000s that I think principally US strategists probably started to realize that China was actually growing and was going to continue to grow, and was such a big country that one day it was actually going to be a competitor with the US. And I think that's when Western media started to shift more towards China.
You made a suggestion that China should invest more in informal discourse, its soft power, and to directly reach out to Western audiences. In what way did you have in mind?
China places a lot of faith in its formal political discourse. China's formal political discourse is delivered in the form of books, it's delivered in the form of white papers, it's delivered in the form of speeches. And all of that, as it's communicated to the Western audience, it's being filtered. It's being filtered by Western politicians, it's being filtered by the Western media. It's being filtered by the very people who are busy portraying China as an adversary. One of the things that China's really good at is making blockbuster movies. And if you're good at blockbuster movies, you can turn anything into a story. For example, China's formal discourse about the rule of law is extremely difficult to read. I mean, I have a legal background. I know a lot about the subject, but even I find it very dry. If you look at American TV drama, what are some of the most popular TV dramas? They're about law. If you think about it hard enough, and if you use creative people who have talent, you can tell the story of rule of law. Instead of telling it through a dry academic book, you can tell a story about the rule of law through a movie or through a TV drama. And you can make it something exciting that communicates a message in a way that actually captivates people's attention on a human level. And the other thing that you can do by taking that approach is you're not getting filtered. You're not getting filtered anymore by politicians and by Western media. You're talking straight to the audience. So that's one simple example of the sort of thing that could be done. But there are other things too. I mean, the formal discourse is a pillar. Soft power in the form of movies is a pillar. But social media is becoming more and more important as a source of information for ordinary people. And that is a different pillar. And it can be used in a different way. For example, there are a lot of people like me nowadays, foreigners who live in China, and we're very active on social media and platforms like Twitter. And we spend a lot of time arguing with people about what China is really like. You could build a strategy around us, bringing us together, allowing us to operate as a team. And then, instead of lone archers wandering around the woods, you've actually got a regiment of archers who are all pointing at a target and are all going to hit it. So social media is a pillar that could be used much better. And one of the other things that China should do is they should segment their audiences better. Rather than just chucking a book out and hoping that it finds an audience, you need to look at do what a sales or a marketing person would do in any commercial company, segment your audience and tailor approaches and tailor messages for them. And one of the most important audience is young people. The thing about young people is they are young. They haven't spent years being given negative messages and internalizing negative messages about China. So talk to them before the negative perception has actually had a chance to form. Talk to them now, talk to them first. How do you talk to them? Not necessarily through old guys like me, through young people like you that are attractive and interesting to them.
Thank you.
A perfect example of that. The Winter Olympics, despite the Western media's best efforts, was actually a huge success. And some young Chinese athletes performed hugely well. Very vast numbers of informed, educated young people in the West interested in winter sports. You can talk to them about things they're interested in, and you can talk to them through people who can connect with them, like China's successful winter sports athletes.
Recently you wrote a preface for a book called My China Story. Can you share with us a little bit about that?
Well, I think that's a really interesting project. I work a lot, as you know, I work on China's international political discourse. I do a lot of political reports. I do a lot of white papers. I'm the editor for the Xi Jinping books, The Governance of China. And one of the concerns I have, I think, is that China, in terms of its international discourse, it concentrates too much on the formal political discourse. And I think it needs to review its strategy and spread it over a much broader range and base it on a number of other pillars. And I think this book is a very interesting and valuable example of that, because it's a book where a lot of foreigners who are either working or studying or living in China, they tell their stories. And it was really interesting, because when I looked in more detail, what I discovered was that there were a huge number of people from all sorts of different cultures and countries, and we all shared things in common about our experience in China. There were women from Pakistan and students from Africa and Eastern Europe. As I looked through the book and as I read it properly and in detail, I saw in almost every single individual something that was interesting, that was something that was shared in common, or something that I was interested in hearing more about. And I think that that proves and demonstrates the value of a work like that, and the value of the idea of seeing foreign people who are in China with a positive view of China as a resource that can really be used to help China's strategy of international discourse.
So the last question is more culture related. So from your perspective, for people who have no experience about Chinese culture, which aspect of Chinese culture would you like to recommend them to explore?
The best way to explore Chinese culture is obviously to come to China, because then you are surrounded by it. But what is interesting is that Chinese culture is spreading very quickly. I mean, China's a huge country, nearly a quarter of the world. If every single person in China who aspires to going abroad to study, for example, if every young person who aspires to go to university abroad to study was able to do that, then it would swamp the whole of the international education system. But very large numbers of them do, and increasing numbers of them do. And what that is actually doing is it's creating substantial Chinese communities in places where 10 or 20 years ago there was little or no Chinese presence. And I can give a really good example of that, which is my hometown of Edinburgh. In 10 years ago, 20 years ago, you would hardly see a Chinese person. What's happened in Edinburgh over the last 10 years is that there's been a huge influx of Chinese students, and they want stuff like proper Chinese food.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in Edinburgh, there are now probably dozens of really good, genuine Chinese restaurants. But the other thing that there are in growing numbers are Chinese supermarkets. When I first used to travel back from China to Scotland in the summer, my wife always used to make us take huge suitcases of Chinese foods and sauces and stuff that you couldn't get in Scotland. Yeah, well, laogama, for example. My son is a big laogama fan. I like it, but he has to have laogama with everything. So we used to have to, and it used to drive me daft, carrying these huge suitcases of stuff. Now, there's a Chinese supermarket at the bottom of my street. I mean, there must be at least half a dozen in Edinburgh now, but there's one right at the bottom of my street, 2 minutes walk from my apartment. So now when my wife tries to fill suitcases with food to cart all the way home again, I just say, no way, don't need to. There's a supermarket at the bottom of the street, and you can essentially get pretty much anything there. So the Chinese students are creating a market which is drawing more people, which actually increases the numbers and increases the range of people. And it means many more Edinburgh people are being exposed to Chinese culture and learning to appreciate it.